Have you ever heard of the president who beat up his own would-be assassin? It sounds like something out of an action movie, but this is a real and frankly wild story from American history. We're talking about Andrew Jackson, a man whose presidency was as fiery and controversial as his personality. And on one cold January day in 1835, that fire was met with an actual spark, the spark of a pistol aimed right at his heart. This isn't just a story about the first ever assassination attempt on a U.S. president. It's a story about luck, rage, a bizarre conspiracy theory, and a moment so strange it almost feels like fiction. So, grab your popcorn as we dive into the dramatic day Andrew Jackson stared down the barrel of a gun and decided to fight back. To understand the chaos of January 30th, 1835, you first need to understand the man at the center of it all, Andrew Jackson. By the time he was president, Old Hickory, as he was known, was already a living legend. He was a celebrated general from the War of 1812, famous for his victory at the Battle of New Orleans. But his reputation wasn't just built on military glory. Jackson was a political force of nature, a populist who championed the common man against what he saw as a corrupt elite. His presidency was a whirlwind of controversy. The most significant battle was his war against the Second Bank of the United States. Jackson saw the bank as a monstrous institution that favored wealthy Northeasterners and had far too much power over the nation's economy. He famously declared, "The bank is trying to kill me, but I will kill it." He vetoed the bank's recharter, pulled federal funds from it, and essentially dismantled the institution. This move was celebrated by his supporters, but his opponents were absolutely furious. They saw him as a tyrant, a dictator trampling on the Constitution. They even formed a new political party, the Whigs, specifically to oppose him. The political atmosphere in Washington was incredibly tense, a powder keg of resentment and anger just waiting for a spark. And on that fateful day, a man named Richard Lawrence decided to provide it. The setting for our drama is the U.S. Capitol building. It was a solemn occasion. President Jackson, along with his cabinet and members of Congress, was attending the funeral of South Carolina Representative Warren R. Davis. The service was held in the hall of the House of Representatives. After the eulogies, the mourners filed out of the chamber, making their way through the Capitol Rotunda and out onto the East Portico for the procession to the cemetery. The 67-year-old president was frail, leaning on the arm of his Treasury Secretary, Levi Woodbury. He was still grieving the loss of his wife, Rachel, and the weight of his turbulent presidency was visible on his face. As he stepped out into the cold winter air, the crowd parted to let him pass. It was in that moment, in the shadow of the massive Capitol columns, that a figure emerged from the crowd. His name was Richard Lawrence. He stepped forward, raised a small single-shot pistol, aimed it directly at Jackson's chest, and pulled the trigger. A loud click echoed across the portico. The percussion cap had ignited, but the gunpowder in the barrel failed to catch fire. A misfire. It was a 1-in-a-million chance, a moment of sheer, dumb luck for the president. But the drama was far from over. Jackson, never one to back down from a fight, saw the pistol aimed at him. His legendary temper flared instantly. Instead of recoiling or seeking cover, he did the most Andrew Jackson thing imaginable. He charged at his attacker. Raising his heavy hickory walking cane, he lunged forward, ready to beat the man senseless. But Lawrence was prepared for failure. He was carrying not one, but 2 pistols. As Jackson rushed him, Lawrence dropped the first gun, drew a second, identical pistol, aimed again at point-blank range, and pulled the trigger. Another click. Unbelievably, the second pistol also misfired. The odds of 2 separate, well-maintained pistols misfiring in a row have been calculated by experts as 1 in 125,000. It was a statistical miracle. By this point, the scene had descended into complete chaos. Before Lawrence could even process his double failure, the enraged 67-year-old president was upon him, swinging his cane with all his might. Sir Jackson struck Lawrence several times before others in the crowd could react. Tennessee Representative Davy Crockett, yes. That Davy Crockett was nearby and helped to wrestle Lawrence to the ground and disarm him. The would-be assassin was quickly subdued and taken into custody, leaving a stunned and furious President Jackson standing on the steps of the Capitol, his cane still in hand. The first attempt to assassinate a U.S. president had ended not with a bang, but with a cane whipping. So, who was this man who tried to kill the president? Richard Lawrence was an English-born house painter who had been living in Washington, D.C. for several years. At first glance, he seemed unremarkable. But as investigators dug into his life, a portrait of a deeply troubled individual emerged. For years, Lawrence had been suffering from delusions of grandeur. He believed he was, in fact, King Richard III of England, and that he was the rightful heir to the British throne. Even more bizarrely, he believed that Andrew Jackson owed him a vast sum of money. In his mind, Jackson's opposition to the Bank of the United States was the sole reason he couldn't access his royal fortune. He had become convinced that if Jackson were out of the way, the money would be released and he could claim his crown. He had told friends and family that Jackson had killed his father, a man who had actually died years earlier in England. His mental state had deteriorated to the point where he saw assassination as a logical, even necessary, course of action. He wasn't part of a grand political conspiracy. He was a man lost in his own fantasy world. Of course, Andrew Jackson didn't see it that way. His mind immediately jumped to a political conspiracy. He was absolutely convinced that his political enemies, particularly the powerful Whig Senator George Poindexter from Mississippi, had hired Lawrence to kill him. Jackson's paranoia was fueled by the fact that Lawrence had done some house painting work for Poindexter. Jackson publicly accused Poindexter of being the mastermind, launching a vicious political attack. He saw the assassination attempt as the ultimate proof that the corrupt aristocrats he was fighting would stop at nothing to destroy him. This accusation consumed the political world for weeks, but investigations and witness testimonies ultimately cleared Senator Poindexter of any involvement. Jackson, however, likely went to his grave believing his enemies were behind the plot. The trial of Richard Lawrence was one of the most sensational of its time. It took place just a few months later, in April 1835. The prosecutor was none other than Francis Scott Key, the man who wrote The Star-Spangled Banner. Lawrence's defense team didn't dispute the facts of the case. How could they? The entire incident had happened in broad daylight in front of dozens of witnesses, including the president himself. Instead, they argued that Lawrence was not guilty by reason of insanity. They brought in doctors and acquaintances who testified to his erratic behavior, his claims of being the King of England, and his bizarre financial delusions. The evidence of his mental instability was overwhelming. When Lawrence himself was given the chance to speak, he launched into a rambling, incoherent speech about his royal claims and the injustices done to him by President Jackson. The jury was convinced. After deliberating for only 5 minutes, they found Richard Lawrence not guilty by reason of insanity. He was committed to a mental institution, where he remained for the rest of his life, passing away in 1861. The story of the 1835 assassination attempt is more than just a historical footnote. It is a fascinating glimpse into a turbulent era of American politics and a testament to the sheer unpredictability of history. It highlights the intense political divisions of the Jacksonian era, where policy disagreements could feel like life or death battles. It gave us the first legal case in the United States where a defendant was acquitted of a crime using the insanity defense. But most of all, it left us with an unforgettable image. A 67-year-old president, frail but full of fury, not running from danger but charging directly into it. Cane raised high. Andrew Jackson was a man of contradictions, a hero to some, a villain to others. But on that cold January day, he proved he was, above all else, a fighter. It's a moment that perfectly encapsulates the wild, combative, and truly unbelievable spirit of old Hickory. Thanks for sticking with us through this incredible story. If you found this piece of history as fascinating as I did, do me a favor and hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the stranger-than-fiction moments of the past. Let us know in the comments what other historical events you'd like to see covered. See you next time.